For some a bit of context as to what happened, this appeared to be something that happened to me when I was a young kid. Now, I don't remember how old I was. I must have been maybe I don't know, 4 or something. We were living in a pretty decent area, had a huge backyard with forest behind it. It was a pretty big backyard. One next door neighbor had a kid, which her name was Jessie, and she was a very nice little girl. She and I used to meet out every time when it was outside. Sometimes she would come over to my house, but I've never been over to her house. Why has that been the case? Well, I don't even know. Something about it just made me feel really weird. Now, Jessie was not a weird, creepy kid, but she did have some quirks that kind of confused me. Our other next door neighbor was actually a friend of my mom's, and they do get along, or were at that point, getting along just fine. Every day when I went outside, I would always look to see where everybody is. I always really curious as to what was going on in that, so every time I would see Jessie outside, I would ask my mom if I could go and play. Whenever she said it was fine, of course, I would do so, and I would head off to go play with the neighbor. Now, Jessie seemed to be really around my age, maybe at least a year or so older. But this is from what my mom thought, but of course, she was around the same age as me. Now, how were people confused about her age is because Jessie was a little taller than me, maybe about at least a few inches in height, but I didn't really mind that. Jessie was a pretty tall woman. Well, girl. Well, I know she's a woman right now, but when she was young around my age, she used to always be outside, and she would always hang out in that. So whenever we had anything going on, I would always ask her how everything's doing. She always say about everything being pretty good, and that we didn't have anything really weird or anything going on at the time. However, though, this honestly was getting me really weird with Jessie. I asked Jessie a couple times if she wanted to come to my house, but she refused. I honestly had no idea why she would refuse. I asked her if she was scared, or maybe she wasn't comfortable. But Jessie refused to say all of it, but I honestly had no idea or understanding as to why she was acting like that. A couple times when I told my mom about it, whatever it be at dinner time or whatever, she said that maybe Jessie either had plans or maybe she just doesn't feel comfortable. But what was making her uncomfortable was something that I didn't understand. Jessie was a very nice student in the class, and she was one of the tallest students ever in the classroom. I honestly had no idea what was up with her, so I thought that maybe there might have been something going on next door that I just don't really know. Because I don't really know what goes on in the house until I know for sure. So this was something I honestly had no understanding or idea why Jessie was acting really strange. One day when I went outside, Jessie was not there, and I was curious. Her car was, her parents' car was there, but I didn't see her outside at all. I thought that maybe she might have been busy, or maybe she wasn't feeling that good, so I waited out by near the fencing area. When I waited out for her, I could hear some yelling coming from inside the house. I thought that maybe it was Jessie's parents or something, so I waited to see if Jessie would come out. But Jessie never did. Within the time I was about to come in the house, when my mom called, I looked to see that there was a man who seemed to be drunk. He looked like he was having a rough day, as he was wearing a tank top and some boxers. I thought that maybe he was just some random drunkard, but why would he be at Jessie's place was something I didn't understand. I didn't know if he was dealing with something going on or if Jessie was in real danger. I ended up telling my mom about that, and that's when she decided to say that she would get the cops involved if she ever were to see him or doing anything to Jesse, as we couldn't really get involved unless something really was going on. When my mom went out to the backyard, the man was gone, so he must have went back in the house or possibly must have went to do something. I ended up going to bed later after because it was around nighttime, around the evening, probably around 8 o'clock, as I had school the next day. I went to school, but Jesse was not there, and this honestly confuses me, but also worries me that Jesse could have been hurt or something. However, though, after school I went out to play, but as I was outside, I saw Jessie came outside as well. What appears to be that she was hurt. I honestly saw some bruises on her and even a black eye. It got me concerned of what happened. I asked Jessie if she got into a fight with someone, and then she said that her dad had hurt her. I then found out later on that Jessie was not alright at all. I told my mom about this, and of course we called the cops as the same time Jessie's mom did. And it turns out that Jesse's dad was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusing her and her mom. Officially, the dad was then arrested and was charged for more child abuse and etc. I'm just glad that Jesse's mother and her dad got divorced and that the dad was sentenced to prison. I don't know how long or something, but it was around maybe a few years at most. Jessie's now a really grown woman from what I can see, even though me and her don't talk anymore. But I can definitely say she's pretty much has forgotten all about, the past so much. So it could really be something, in my opinion. Whenever I always was here at nighttime, I would look over and wave to Jessie, who was in her bedroom. That was in her house across from where I was. So, I'm an adult now, but I honestly did feel bad for Jessie at the time. I still hope that Jessie will never have to face anything like this again, even in the future years. It's really hard to say because who really knows what can happen? I'm just glad that my mom, and I had found out more about why Jessie didn't come out to play a couple times. I never thought she was a weird kid until I realized why she only came out at certain times. It was because of her dad. I hope her dad goes to rotten hell, especially what he did. A little bit of background information. This took place sometime maybe 2009 or 2010. One of my neighbors had an issue with their neighbors, and I'm going to give this a little bit of backstory. Now, it was a couple that had a girl who was about 7 years old. Since their girl was 7, their youngest of her girl was only 3.5. The couple were in their 30s and they were pretty nice. The man's name was Paul, and the wife's name was Charmaine. Charmaine and Paul were pretty nice people, and my parents have known them for at least a few years before they moved to Thunder Bay, which is another town. At the time, though, while they were living there, the weirdest neighbor they had to see was someone by the name of Jared. Jared seemed to be around maybe in his 40s or something, and he was living on his own. He was living next door to Paul and Charmaine, and Charmaine and Paul would every time would see him and wave to him and say, "Hey, how are you doing?" But a couple times the neighbor would just ignore them. Paul would officially just ignore them a couple times, mainly because the neighbor seemed to be a little sketchy. Charmaine just said that maybe he was just paranoid or something, but of course, his mind said otherwise. A few times while their son, who happened to be at least a few years older than the girl, probably 10, would come over from seeing his grandparents every weekend. When he was out there with his sisters, the neighbor was always out there. He seemed to be looking like something was going on. He tried to make himself look like he was busy when Charmaine or Paul came out. This became a little bit more of a cycle when the kids were out playing, so it was no big surprise that the neighbor would be out. However, though, this was definitely something that they weren't expecting. When they ended up looking over to have a barbecue party, the neighbor asked if he could join, to which Paul said no, seeing that there was something skeptical about this man. Now, this man kind of frowned and looked like he was upset, but he just went on with his own way, and that was it. However, though, that didn't end there, though. When Paul and Charmaine were getting ready for bed, they ended up hearing what seemed to be knocks in their front door. They ended up getting out of bed and going down the stairs to see that the neighbor was outside at the door. He said, "I know you guys are in there." He started trying to bang down the door to break it, but Paul ended up saying, "Go away, I'm calling the police." He threatened the neighbor, who somehow ended up retreat back to his house. When the cops came, they ended up investigating the neighbor and arrested him. And eventually it was revealed later that this neighbor was wanted for assaulting women and even violating them in many ways. He had been somehow stalking a few kids for at least a few months in hopes of trying to get more into the parents and that. That was the only time that Charmaine and Paul had an issue with this neighbor, but ever since they moved, they've never seen that neighbor again. And they really hope this neighbor never does the same thing to other neighbors like this again. They still get freaked out every time they think about this story, but it's best that they end up acting like they've forgotten it and just move on from it. This happened about maybe a few months ago, and this happened to one of my friends who had a next door neighbor who just moved into the house that she was living in. My friend's name at the time of the story, we will call her by the name Emma. Emma was about 24, and she was living on her own in a pretty decent house. It was appropriate for a family with two kids. It's a wife and a husband, so Emma was basically using her leftover rooms for her own things. Of course, this neighbor who just moved in seemed to be pretty decent. So with that, Emma decided to go and surprise the neighbor with presents. The presents that she got were at least a couple cookies and flowers to welcome the person to the neighborhood. The person who opened the door happened to be his name was Bob, and he seemed to be pretty friendly. He said to Emma that he felt welcome in the neighborhood, so there was no issues there. However, Emma started to see something off about Bob. Now, when that happened was about at least a month after Bob moved in. Now, Emma decided to ask Bob if she could help him with things, which were to clean the house. Emma had been a cleaning lady for a while, ever since high school, just so she could raise enough money to get her own place and even do other stuff. Which the money she had been saving up was to get her a new house, so she'd been doing cleaning since high school. She never had an issue with cleaning, as most people would think cleaning is boring. But however, with Bob, he said that he was willing to pay her the double if she had to work overtime, which on some occasions that she did. However, something really strange about Bob started happening. I think it was some weird movements, and he had his phone out, taking pictures of Emma. Now, Emma wasn't really fully aware about this neighbor. Maybe she didn't even know he was taking photos of her. Because if she did, she would have asked him to not do that, and he would have respected her privacy. But that's when things started to go a bit off. Bob then had a frown and said okay and just moved on. However, the next day, Bob was going to be on vacation, So he ended up telling Emma that there was a spare key in his mailbox and that she could use that key to get in the house. So while Bob was on vacation in Miami, Emma took the spare key from the mailbox and kept it for herself, and she started visiting and cleaning his house. However, the one rule that kind of really phrases her was to not go in the basement. This honestly confused her as to what could Bob possibly be hiding in the basement. She ended up was cleaning the house on one day and decides to discover the basement. She goes down the stairs and turns on to find the basement to be empty. There wasn't really much, just a table with some tools, and there was some other stuff. She ended up looking over to see that there were places where a washer and dryer should be, so she didn't have that issue. She wondered why Bob could be preventing her from going down in the basement. This honestly really had to be something. Emma then looked around, but then could smell a very foul odor. It honestly hit her like a bullet, and she felt like she could vomit and pass out. But as she felt that she was going to vomit any moment, she ended up looking where the smell was coming from. The smell was coming from a corner of the room where there were garbage bags. Emma didn't even want to look in there, but it smelled of rotting flesh. Some were probably rotting already, some were at least a week or so old. The smell of it was so gross that Emma had no idea why was this Bob person didn't want her to go to the basement. She found that there were stains of blood coming out from one of the garbage bags. She ended up calling the cops after she ran back upstairs, and the cops investigated Bob's place. However, when Bob returned from his vacation, they ended up arresting him, and he was sentenced to a couple years in jail, probably 20 or so years in jail. Emma had discovered that Bob was somewhat of a serial killer who lured girls in his basement where he would violate them, torture them, and then mutilate their bodies in many ways and stuff them in bags to avoid evidence. Of course, Emma was very glad she went in the basement to see, because even if she didn't want to, Bob then hated her with a passion, said the first thing he would do if he were to get out of the basement was to come back for her. However, though, he's still in prison, and Emma had never viewed cleaning anything the same way again for people's houses. Of course, she stopped doing cleaning for people's houses for at least a while after this incident. But she wondered, why were these women cleaning before her? That's not the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was the photos that Bob had on his phone. They were pictures of women cleaning, even zoomed in on their parts. One of them was a picture of Emma's house, and the other part was when she was in her room sleeping. Honestly, Emma was pretty petrified about this, that she ended up having her boyfriend move in with her for a while. She never had any issues like this again with any neighbor, but she's still pretty terrified about this experience. This was during the winter of 2016. It was around January, and this happened to one of my friends. One of my friends' names was Sarah, and she was 17 at the time of this story. When Sarah was moving things around one night while she was living in her house, her next door neighbor ended up frantically knocking at her door. It was around maybe 10 o'clock at night, and since Sarah was home alone, her parents were not going to be home till late at night. Sarah opened the door for her neighbor, who said that her husband had been murdered and someone was out to kill her. After letting her in, Sarah ended up calling the cops, and she didn't really remember what happened after that. As it went through very quickly, quickly, things started to go from 1 to 100. It apparently was revealed that a neighbor who lived on Sarah's street wanted to murder her next door neighbor due to not paying them enough money. I don't really remember why Sarah's neighbors had that issue or anything, but one of their neighbors probably had somewhat of a grudge against them. Now, Sarah's next door neighbors were pretty friendly and all that, but this was honestly a very surprising thing called, or at least surprising thing that Sarah ever had to deal with. Nothing like this has happened again, but she was honestly quite confused as to what actually happened. She did try to look into it more, or by trying to get someone to maybe fill her in, but she doesn't really remember what happened much about it. All she knows is that this person had a grudge against them and have been wanting to murder her neighbors. She has no idea who they were or anything like this, but this was honestly something that she never expected to handle on a situation like it. However, though, she's never had anything like this again, and the person who tried to kill them, apparently the man or whoever it was gone. They still don't know if this man is still on the loose or if he's gotten away, locked in prison. Who really knows? Sarah had a really hard time trying to stay at home alone when her parents were at work for at least the next 2 years. But ever since then, nothing like this has happened since.